This video was sponsored by Brilliant.
The gravest domestic threat facing our nation today.
Are you guys high?
We're actually rolling.
Is drugs.
Here, take this.
What is this?
Chemists call it MDMA. Users have a word for it.
Ecstasy.
I don't feel anything.
In short, drugs are sapping our strength as a nation.
I am a pretty anxious person. A lot of people might classify me as type A, and I'd guess that it's the same for a lot of other highly educated, highly motivated, highly anxious women. One of my main anxiety symptoms is ruminating. I get stuck in cycles of negative thoughts. I've always thought of them as downward spirals where my brain leads me down, down, down into a dark and scary place where I'm surrounded by everyday fears and stressors that are blown way out of proportion. During grad school, I was experiencing insomnia, lying awake in the middle of the night, beating myself up about all kinds of nonsense. At a certain point, I couldn't take it anymore, and I decided to start taking medication. And the medication, it helps. It made a really big difference in my symptoms and made the rest of grad school much easier for me. And since then, I've had my ups and downs with my anxiety. Most of the time it's fine, but sometimes it comes roaring back, keeping me up at night wondering what I'm doing with my life or thinking about that insensitive thing I said to a friend 4 years ago. Sometimes when I'm lying there, I fantasize about a cure. Something I could do to just shut that voice up. A pill I could take that would just make all that anxiety and self-criticism evaporate and let me take a look at my life without that negative lens. Sounds pretty great, doesn't it? Well, while no such true miracle drug exists, there is a drug that comes pretty close. MDMA, which is also called ecstasy or Molly, is considered an entactogen or an empathogen, which is a substance that produces a feeling of emotional openness, empathy, and strong feelings of relatedness. Some people call MDMA the love drug for that reason. MDMA stands for 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, and it was developed by the pharmaceutical company Merck in 1912. Now, there's not a whole lot known about the origins of the substance. Apparently, there was even a rumor that Merck was trying to develop an appetite suppressant when they stumbled upon the drug. But the company's research records indicate otherwise. MDMA was probably actually uncovered while Merck was trying to find ways around their competitor Bayer's patent for a clotting agent that could be used to stop bleeding. So often, while developing pharmaceutical drugs, you have to take multiple synthesis steps to get to the final chemical structure that you want. During one of those steps toward their own version of the clotting drug, the Merck scientists working on the project synthesized MDMA as an intermediary compound, and they called it methylsaphylamine. Now, at the time, they had no special interest in this substance, probably because they didn't test it on any human patients. But MDMA was patented that same year, without a name, as part of the larger patent for that clotting drug. Over the next 30 to 40 years, other Merck scientists played around with the chemical a little bit, and it was believed that it could have some pharmaceutical use, but it seems like no one really guessed at the psychoactive effects of the substance. However, it kept coming up like a bad penny, and in 1953, the US Army sponsored a secret study to investigate its effects. This was part of the military search for a truth drug that they could use to more easily interrogate people. After very little animal research, the military identified several substances that are very similar to MDMA, including MDE, MDA, and DMA, and began administering these drugs to patients at the New York State Psychiatric Institute without the patient's consent or knowledge. After a patient died, the Army ceased human testing and instead decided to figure out the toxicity of these psychoactive drugs, including MDMA and mescaline, by injecting them into animals. Very cool. Perhaps due to the toxicity levels being an issue, or perhaps due to other factors, the military abandoned this group of drugs in 1955 and instead shifted their focus to LSD, which eventually led the CIA to start Project MK Ultra, which I will save for another video because it is worth its own whole discussion. But I'm getting distracted. If we're going to talk about MDMA, we need to talk about Alexander Shulgin. Alexander Shulgin, American chemist, pharmacologist, and the godfather of ecstasy. He's often credited as the person who introduced MDMA to the world. He was quite talented in his field and an experienced psychonaut. His prior history of using psychoactive drugs led him to want to explore this field both as the chemist and as the test subject. So he set up a fully legal lab in his backyard. He claimed that he first synthesized MDMA in 1965, not in his backyard. But it wasn't until the 1970s that he began to learn about its psychoactive effects from a student. Now, it's worth pointing out that others in the US were probably already using the drug recreationally, but it would have been highly underground at that point, so nobody would have really known about it. Alexander wasn't specifically interested in MDMA because his focus was generally on drugs with stronger psychedelic effects. But he appreciated that it was relaxing and disinhibiting. His wife, Anne, however, worked as a lay therapist, and she had been incorporating psychoactive substances into her sessions with clients. It turns out, having a chemist husband makes that kind of thing pretty convenient. And in fact, Anne was generally the patient zero for testing the new drugs he brewed up in his lab. Together, they recognized that MDMA might be useful in therapy. They even called MDMA window because of how it created clarity and openness in its users. Anne and Alexander shared MDMA with friends and colleagues, including Leo Zeff, a psychotherapist who pioneered the use of psychedelics in therapy in the 1970s. Now, Zeff went on to train some 4,000 therapists in the US and Europe in how to use MDMA in therapy. Therapists would provide a space for the patient to leverage the increased openness and communication generated by the drug into self-discovery. And it was reported to help with a wide variety of psychiatric conditions, from depression to PMS to autism. It was also popular in couples counseling because it broke down emotional walls and allowed for more open communication between individuals. It's really interesting to read the perspectives and experiences of people who used MDMA during this time frame. It was mostly used in small group settings and was seen as relaxing, cozy, and chill, a way to connect more deeply with your partner or your friends. And that doesn't really match well with the party drug that most people, including me, think of when they usually think of MDMA, with like glow sticks and fuzzy boots and crowded dance clubs. It was around the late 1970s that MDMA began to expand outside of the therapy circles and into that broader recreational scene, which is also around the time that it came to the attention of the federal government.
The Drug Enforcement Administration wants it controlled like heroin, a drug considered to have no medical use.
In fact, the Shulgins, and many of the therapists who used MDMA, were opposed to the recreational use of the substance because they knew that widespread use was likely to lead to it being outlawed. And they were right. As new groups began to manufacture MDMA, some of them began to market it as a party drug, which dramatically expanded its use. This is when it got its more popular name,
Ecstasy.
Ecstasy? Ecstasy.
Through the 70s and into the early 80s, MDMA gradually made its way into the college and gay party scenes. Then, in 1984, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, recommended scheduling MDMA, basically placing the substance under strict regulations regarding its manufacture and control, essentially outlawing it for the average person.
The Drug Enforcement Administration is announcing its intention to place the drug known as MDMA, or by the street name ecstasy, under emergency controls in Schedule 1.
You can learn more about the Controlled Substances Act and what it meant for the use of mind-altering substances in America over at Micah's video on using street drugs to treat mental illness. I'm not going to get into it right now. After a hearing, despite pushback from psychology experts and researchers, MDMA was classified as a Schedule I drug in the summer of 1985. Even though psychiatrists and therapists had provided evidence that MDMA has a clear medical benefit in a therapeutic setting, and even though an administrative judge had recommended that the drug be classified as Schedule III, the DEA administrator refused to classify it at a lower and thus more accessible level. MDMA use dropped off pretty dramatically after that, though it is still one of the most popular illicit drugs in the world. Once you start reading about the drug's effects, it's not hard to see why it's so popular. People who take MDMA report that it increases their energy, their sense of empathy, their self-confidence, and pleasure, as well as altered or heightened physical sensations. There's a reason it's called ecstasy. It is euphoric, leading to strong feelings of well-being and happiness. People in the rave scene enjoy it because of its stimulant properties, and because it's very disinhibiting and can generate a sense of community with the people around them. It's sometimes taken with other substances, usually psychedelics such as LSD or magic mushrooms, to enhance the effect, an experience called flipping. Because it's a stimulant, in addition to the psychoactive effects, it can make you jittery and sweaty, cause your heart to beat faster, lead to teeth grinding, nausea and dehydration, and can cause insomnia. So not everything's fun. When ingested, MDMA enters neurons in the brain, binding to dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin transporters. Once it gets inside the cell, it disrupts the normal neurotransmitter reuptake and recycling systems, and the end result is that it causes the neuron to pour out neurotransmitters into the synapse even when there is no action potential causing the cell to fire. So the net effect is that your brain basically dumps out a lot of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin all at once. These neurotransmitters do a lot in the brain. They play key roles in energy, cognition, and learning and memory. But dopamine and serotonin are probably best known for their effects on mood and emotional state. Dopamine drives feelings of motivation and reward, while serotonin drives feelings of happiness and pleasure. So MDMA generally feels really good because it's flooding your brain with the major neurotransmitters that make you feel good. This might also be part of why recreational MDMA users report the Tuesday blues, feelings of sadness, anxiety, and irritability in the days following its use. Because your brain is depleted of all of those feel-good chemicals, and it takes a little while for them to build back up in your system. Now, unlike magic mushrooms and many of the other traditional psychedelics, whose negative side effects are generally limited to poor decision-making while you're tripping and unpleasant experiences like bad trips, although there are many people who would argue that there's no such thing as a bad trip, reckless MDMA use can actually be pretty dangerous. In the short term, MDMA can cause dangerous overheating and dehydration. It can also lead to serotonin syndrome, which is a condition where excessive serotonin in the synapses of the brain can lead to fever, seizures, and even death. This is especially risky if MDMA is taken alongside other drugs that affect serotonin signaling, such as SSRIs, a very common type of antidepressant. Heavy use of MDMA is also associated with heart valve damage, long term. Now, as for its impact on the brain, the dose and the frequency that can lead to dangerous brain changes are a topic of hot debate in the research community. MDMA metabolizes into reactive oxygen species that can cause neurological damage. Regular use of the drug appears to lead to changes in overall serotonin signaling, with some researchers arguing that even a single dose can irreversibly alter serotonin pathways in the brain. Again, heavy use of the substance is also associated with neurotoxicity, shrinkage of certain brain regions, and memory impairment. Now, compare that to shrooms or LSD, which we're pretty sure are less likely to cause harmful physical changes to your brain. So far, the general consensus is that infrequent use at relatively modest recreational doses of MDMA is probably fine, but MDMA also has reasonably high abuse potential. I mean, who wouldn't want to keep chasing a euphoric high? Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, users report that frequent use rapidly leads to tolerance, which renders the MDMA much less effective. The general safety takeaway here is don't take wild risks with this drug. Moderation. It seems like it's probably okay to do a little bit of Molly once or twice a year at a party, but things could go rapidly awry if you were to take it too often or at too high of doses. Unlike with magic mushrooms, I can kind of see why this one got the illicit label. But even that is changing. Remember how psychology experts pushed back against the scheduling of MDMA because they argued that it had therapeutic value? Everything old is new again. As with other scheduled substances, while the scheduling made it extremely difficult for many scientists to access MDMA and study its effects, there were a handful of cases where researchers were given approval to study the drug's potential use for treating mental illness. In 2017, the US Food and Drug Administration gave MDMA the Breakthrough Therapy designation for the treatment of PTSD after positive results from 2 phase 2 trials, opening the door for more research into its impacts. In one of those early studies, over 80% of subjects who received MDMA-assisted therapy no longer even met the criteria for PTSD after the study, versus just 25% of people who received a placebo.
Take your first capsule?
Sure. This disconnects the physiological response. That you don't get a panic attack, you don't get the adrenaline kick, all that fight or flight stuff doesn't happen.
Long-term follow-ups showed that the positive outcomes were still present up to 3 years later. That said, it's important to note that the study was small, just 20 participants, and it wasn't very well blinded, meaning that people who received the MDMA may have experienced a response expectancy effect. Basically, they knew they were getting the drug, so they thought it would work, and so it did. More recent phase 3 double-blind placebo-controlled studies, so very highly controlled, have had similarly positive outcomes. People who received the MDMA during the studies were twice as likely to recover from their PTSD compared to someone who had received a placebo. Almost 90% of the MDMA subjects experienced a clinically meaningful reduction in their PTSD symptoms, which is huge. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS for short, who sponsored these trials, is also exploring the potential for MDMA to treat eating disorders, social anxiety, and anxiety associated with late-stage illness. In addition to its potential application in PTSD, the substance is also being studied for the treatment of alcohol use disorder and as a rapid-acting antidepressant.
That what they found was like this really big difference between the MDMA study they did and the treatment as usual. And at their final time point there at 9 months, there was as much as 75% of the MDMA treated group was still not meeting this threshold of problematic use. And so this is a huge difference between 21% versus 75%.
After 4 hours, the MDMA part of the session is over.
I just got the jitters and happiness going on. I feel like the weight of the world is off my shoulders for the first time in ever.
Which actually makes a lot of sense given its mechanism of action. Traditional antidepressant medications are believed to treat the condition by boosting synaptic serotonin in the brain, which MDMA excels at. There's a decent chance that MDMA will be approved as a medical treatment in the next couple of years, which would open the door for even more potential therapeutic applications. One area where I think it could make a huge difference is in couples therapy.
Under the influence of the drug, they'll undergo what basically looks like normal psychotherapy. They're talking about things, but they may find that they're able to do so without so much clamming up and with a sense of compassion toward themselves and their partner. And afterwards, what's really important is that there's a consolidation period where the effect of the drug wears off after maybe 2-3 hours, and you debrief about what happened. What did we learn? And then the point is then to take those lessons and implement them in your everyday life.
Couples therapy was actually one of the original applications of the drug, so it's not really a surprise that people are still exploring it in that setting. Basically breaking down communication barriers and creating a happy, empathetic, connected state of consciousness to allow couples to address relationship challenges and express their appreciation for one another in a safe, comfortable space. In fact, there has already been at least one study on the topic in couples where one partner had PTSD. All in all, I think this is all very exciting. MDMA is not without its risks, don't get me wrong, but neither are many other medications. I could really see MDMA being a pretty unique form of treatment. You take it once, potentially, for this really fast-acting, dramatic change. If this love drug has the potential to help people who are struggling with mental illness, or even just serious communication and connection challenges, it's probably worth exploring its use in a protected medical or therapeutic setting. Because, like I said at the top, The idea of taking a pill that could basically instantly quiet the critical, anxious voice in my head is extremely appealing. I'm eager to see if the FDA does approve its use, and if so, what comes next? I'm sure there will be an explosion of new research when it hits the proverbial shelves. And while there's no such thing as a magic pill to do, well, pretty much anything, it is true that these days there are a lot of new technologies that make our lives a lot easier. Take learning about STEM topics, for example. I passed on learning computer science in college because it was really challenging, and I was already busy with my neuroscience coursework. But given how integral data and computer science are to the neuroscience field these days, I wish I had taken the time to learn it then. Luckily, nowadays, I have brilliant.org. If you're looking to learn more about math, data science, or computer science, or even just the scientific process in general, Brilliant is the best way to do it. Their lessons are fun and incredibly interactive and engaging, with thousands of lessons across a wide variety of topics and expertise levels. And they're adding new lessons every month. And no matter where you are in your learning journey, Brilliant customizes their content to fit your needs and lets you learn at your own pace. I've said before that Brilliant is a great way to get started if you're interested in going into neuroscience, because their lessons can give you a solid introduction to data science and coding in a way that's easy to understand and, more importantly, to apply. But if you're hearing this and you're thinking, well, I don't need to learn about algorithms or geometry, if you're watching this video, then Brilliant probably does have something for you, because their courses go beyond just learning about topics and actually provide information on how to apply concepts to real life. They even have courses that help keep you up to date on the hottest concepts in the tech world and boost your analytical skills to support your career growth. Like, take their Exploring Data Visually course. It's a whole program to help you learn how to choose the right visualizations for understanding your data and for creating effective communication of it. Given our increasingly visual world, these lessons can give you a leg up in developing the most appealing and useful data visualizations. Have I convinced you yet? When you're ready to check it out for yourself, head to brilliant.org/neurotransmissions and sign up for free for 30 days. And the first 200 of you to go to that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. So you're really getting a lot of bang for your buck. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you have any personal experience with MDMA, I'd love to hear about your experiences down below. When I did the video about shrooms, I had a lot of people commenting while they were literally tripping on shrooms. So if you're on MDMA right now, be safe, we love you, and tell us how you're doing. I'd also be curious to hear what your thoughts and feelings are on MDMA. Do you think it should be allowed for use in a medical setting? Would you use it if a therapist legally offered it to you? Do you think it should be available for full recreational use? And why or why not? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching this episode of Neurotransmissions. I'm Allie Astrocyte. Over and out.